The first things I did to start the mixing process, cut down every sample to the place where it plays, taking all of the blank spaces, and then I set the markers. All of the markers imply a section of the music. Then Ableton doesn't have any slots for post fader or post mixer plugins. I had to set up return. I used this return as my master output to check the volume of the elements. I also added some metering and for me to check the either left or right of the mixes or the mono or side. Also frequency bands with buttons where I can turn off and on frequency band. I also set up my metering devices such as the frequency spectrum analyzer span. I also use Waves past position stereo analyzer. I also have here a Waves LUFS meter, a FabFilter Pro L2 to actually reads properly transients. I must also say that the Pro L2 and the Pro C2 are, yes, they are a limiter and a compressor, but they have nothing, no settings dialed, nothing is happening. It's just for metering. There are my SonarWorks calibration, speaker and phone calibration plugins. Then I started balancing everything, the levels, did some stereo positioning of some elements that didn't sound were in the right place, such as these overheads. And I did a technique here that was separating the L side from the right side and automating with a pen from utility. I automated the panning of the left side, more left in the chorus sections, and the rights come in. So, and when it's the hi-hats part, the overheads aren't as much left. So I took care of that positioning, really was careful using mono to position my positioning volume wise. Drums, most importantly my kick, my snare. I EQ'd in mono my drums, made sure the kick and the snare came out. Also did that with the bass, make them stand out really low volume to prepare them to be played in an environment where the music will be in lower volume. So did that with the bass. So right away also I started taking care of the compression. Also it's worth mentioning that I group tracks together or just puts them together in the ones that make sense to be together, colored. Most of my tracks I like to color, also name them. I change the names a little. My first impressions when I laid down the audio tracks, of course, the levels were all over the place. You couldn't make sense of the song. Panoramics, the stereo images of some tracks weren't that pretty. One thing that I really was looking forward to this module was learning, choose the best types of saturation, compression, and I thought that I could really turn this thin mix to something powerful and thick, and a mix that would sound good even in a cell phone speaker or even a grot box, as they say, the best mix that could be played anywhere. Some problems I can say that I found are, for example, the hi-hats and the overheads for that matter had bleed from the kick and the snare, and I tried to filter that as much as possible as I left lead from the kick and the snare to the room track to give that character to the drums. I also of course had to gate the kick and the snare to avoid bleed from the other elements. I used this half-second stairway convolution reverb as I was once listening to this video of, I think it was Mixing Engineers, that talked about recording a drum set in stereo, and that inputted a nice sound into the drum set, and I think it fits well into the hi-hat. I compressed it with a slow attack, applied some compression to make the transients of the hi-hats stand out, and I did kind of the opposite to the overheads. I used a plugin that's Rough Rider 3. I like this plugin. It has a really strong New York compression preset. Overheads were sounding really RMSy, and these hi-hats was sounding really picky, and at the end they combined into a really nice combination. In my drums, mostly I didn't apply that much distortion and saturation, although I used compressors that are emulations of analog compressors. Most of them are API. I also use CLA 76 to control peaks. Of course, the API was to compress the body, but gain stage it afterwards. The attack would be slow to let the peak pass. For example, I have here a little bit of a exception. This snare side stick, I used a tape to saturate it and give a little bit of delay. For example, in the snare side stick room track, I use this plugin that's simulation from EMI, and it is good to equalize rooms. So in the snare up, I add a little bit of snap. I really enjoyed what I did to my bass. As the Philly said, you should compress a lot of bass. Some notes have their tails going really down there, and you don't want that because they'll get lost in the picks. I did lots of compression, of course, to the body with an API 250, as the bass is already quite low, so we kind of need some mids in there. With a slow attack, really wanted to hear that finger plucking. Really gives a nice feel to the song of syncopation, the fundamentals of these toms. I added this sign shepherd distortion that I really like, that really powerful. It brings harmonics that is straight ahead in the next octave higher. In my harmony section, I started using less API stuff and started using more EMIs to give more of that Beatles feel. Here in this element that is the lower one compared to the other elements, use the TG12345 as its solid state console that gives higher harmonic content distortion in the higher frequencies. And also, as the lecturer said, I actually thought as it is solid state type of console, it would give a more higher, but as the lecturer showed in the presentation, also gives a warm saturation, which I quite liked. Also, I have this tape here that is giving a slight stereo spread, really good, because here, for example, as this element is already quite stereo enough, I use here an LFO automate the rotation of this panoramic plugin. I also added another one just so it doesn't mess with this one. So this tape really helped to make this part even more stereo. These chorus parts, you can see some equalization, especially some bells sticking out of the present and byte range of these guitars playing riffs to make them stand out on their own. I actually found this higher one that it is lower in volume, but I think it is more noticeable than the low one, as it is the rules of loudness. So I gave the notch on the lower one a higher gain. Also, I left the notches in different places so they would have their bite and presence in different places. Of course, this equalization would be considered ugly if they're solos, but it does make a difference when they're played in the context of the mix. You can see an even more equalizing separation between elements in the last bridge, as I call it. the one where the really loud guitar comes in, I equalize this notch here to give that bite and presence in this element, and another one here, as well as it's worth saying that in all these elements, either this one or these ones, I wanted to really their character and for them to don't be confused together. The lead vocal was a part that I was anticipating quite a bit. I had a plan to use a special reverb on it, reverb from waves that you can actually dial in the distance that the element from the walls of the. I thought it was a cool idea, almost like a character reverb. In the end I thought it really gave like this played feel to it. I also add a shapes to it and add a lot of drive, and I think it really sounds great with that vocal. I also add this convolution hall reverb from waves. I mostly added it to the harmony section, and as I said earlier, this stairway convolution reverb was more for the drum set. Worth mentioning that I added a little bit of this one to the snare, and that's the only thing I added to the drum set besides the stereo convolution reverb. Talking about the processing I did to the vocals is that I made an isolating gate that would pick up the lower notes, especially the ones that he sings first, build them up a little bit. Sometimes I think he did a good job at picking some words up. Afterwards, yes, as I didn't want to have sibilance in my compression, CLA2A to add that smooth compression, CLA76 to pull the peaks down even more, and so I can gain stage it afterwards and make it louder in the end. I added this tape saturation, which I really did enjoy, dialed a bit the hall. I also dial other elements into this NY compression to squash them in this bus to give them a little bit more RMS. I did like adding just little automations of effects and volumes to add a little bit more feel into the music. And actually, sometimes there's a part in the music. I really like this part as I didn't do much at all besides automating the peak reduction in this pad, in this guitar pad. One final creative automation that I would like to point out was here in the second verse, before the second chorus, I actually automated the two guitar elements that are opposed to one another into the opposite side, and since this element was with an LFO, penning it to the left, to the far left, I had to use an utility with a stereo swap and a chain where I used as a dry wet, and as I made the transition, I swapped the stereo so it would be hit in the last strum here to the far right. I'm really happy with the result. I think you enjoy listening to it. I look forward to do more mixing. What I would do, the approaches I would take differently. I had to do it again. My approach would be in the start of the mixing, I would place audio racks in all the elements and turn them off and on accordingly to when those elements play to avoid doing that later, so I can save CPU and of course by placing my plugins inside those audio racks. I think I would use more precise compression with 5 filters compressors such as Pro C2 and be more careful with CLA 2A or other soft compressors that have an analog character, as sometimes I think they compress too much and they are quite difficult to control. I would use them only for slight compression and coloration. I would prepare templates for such as for my MIDI mix, where I could have lots of compressors with a click of buttons. Prepare templates of audio rigs where I would have lots of compressors, gators, saturation units, all prepared in each track. I would, as I said before, in these audio rec presets, I would also create this Ableton lets us do this audio recs with macros that control similar compressors, and then I could choose between these compressors that would have that analog coloration but with the similar parameters that I dialed in the common macros.